I'm happy to put it anywhere else.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's workshop, Tobacco Vendor Licensing, the way forward to strengthening and advancing tobacco control, progress, lesson, and challenges. Your microphone has been muted to avoid background noise, and we encourage you to turn your webcam on throughout the session when you can. Can we please ask you to change your display name to your name and country? Click on Participant on the bottom menu bar, hover the mouse over your name, click on More, click on Rename, enter your name and country on the screen name field, and click the OK button. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions and comments to today's presenters by typing your questions into the chat. And you can send questions via the chat at any time during the session. The moderators will collect them and address them after the speakers' presentations in the allocated Q&A sections. You will have the opportunity to intervene in today's sessions by submitting a request to do so via the chat or by raising your hand. The moderators will record your request and inform you when you can intervene. They will have the opportunity to provide feedback in the end of a session evaluation survey, which will appear directly in your browser once the meeting closes. And it's important to complete the survey right after the workshop, as the link will only be available for a short period of time. You will receive a certificate based on your attendance and the completion of the evaluation survey. Please note that this session is being recorded and the recording will be available to the public a few days after the sessions. Finally, it is my pleasure to inform you that today's chairs are Dr. Vinayak Mohan Prasad and Dr. Joanna Cohen. Now over to you, Dr. Rana Singh.
Thank you, Caroline. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you attending this important workshop. I am Dr. Rana J. Singh, working as Deputy Regional Director with the Union's Southeast Asia office based in Delhi. I am once again immensely pleased to welcome all of you to this important workshop on tobacco vendor licensing, the way forward to strengthening and advancing tobacco control. It's really a matter of pleasure that we have more than 250 participants who have shown interest and registered for this workshop, which really shows interest of the people in this relatively a new area. Know about this workshop. As you are all aware that tobacco products are widely available throughout the world, and unregulated point of sale lead to easy accessibility and availability of tobacco products, especially to youth. In many countries, tobacco vendors are not required to have dedicated license to operate. Consequently, tobacco is commonly sold in a variety of vendor types, especially in low and middle income countries. Whether it is a convenience store, grocery shop, pharmacies, tea and coffee shops, eateries, everywhere. Tobacco is being sold by almost everywhere. And locations, as far as locations are concerned, very strategically near educational institutions, youth frequented areas like playgrounds, parks. In this regard, reducing access to tobacco products and limiting tobacco industry presence in the retail environment is an important tobacco control strategy, which is now being discussed globally. In addition, without records of which vendors are selling tobacco, implementing and enforcing retailer tobacco laws such as advertising is much more challenging in such an environment. Therefore, there is an urgent need to regulate point of sale. And one of the most effective ways to implement this strategy is in the retail setting is through robust tobacco vendor licensing laws. Therefore, today's workshop will focus on discussing emerging policy measures of tobacco vendor licensing to advance tobacco control nationally and internationally and subnationally, with an aim of understanding the specific opportunities and challenges and the way forward. Thank you once again for your participation. Now, before we really start, I would request my colleague Caroline to activate the poll for about 1 month. So before we really start, so we have about 1 minute for all the participants to complete this poll. So 1 minute starts.
Do you have experience of supporting the enactment or implementation of tobacco norms? This enactment, do you have experience of? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So Caroline, we can end the poll. Yes, it's 1 minute. Caroline?
Yes.
So thank you, everyone. Now, to start, so we have among us eminent people who are authority in tobacco control to chair this session. First, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Joanna Kohn. Dr. Joanna Kohn is the Bloomberg Professor of Disease Prevention and the Director of Institute for Global Tobacco Control at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She has been involved in tobacco control research for more than 20 years. Trained in epidemiology and health policy, her research interests focus on the factors that affected adoption and implementation of public health policies and on evaluating the beneficial effects of and the unintended consequences of such policies. She has worked on studies of both Canadian and US legislators regarding tobacco and tobacco control policy, a longitudinal cohort of smokers focusing on factors and influencing quitting behavior, tobacco promotion at point of sale, tobacco prices, including taxes, tobacco packaging, option for reducing the physical availability of tobacco products, and tobacco industry interference in tobacco control. So you can see a wide variety of experience as well as tobacco control is concerned. She is also deputy editor of Journal of Tobacco Control. So welcome, Dr. Joanna. Thank you for your time. Again, I am also pleased to welcome Dr. Vanek Prasad, who is unit head and leads the WHO Tobacco Free Initiative and is responsible for overall coordination of global tobacco control program in WHO, including licensing with the WHO regions and with the convention secretariat to WHO FCTC. He joined WHO PFI in December 2009 to manage the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation building capacity for tobacco control in WHO's African region. As global head, Dr. Prasad also coordinates the tobacco control program, including implementation of key demand reduction measures. As you're aware, WHO Empower is very important, and tobacco product regulation and cessation services. An expert in trade, taxes, anti-smuggling laws, he was invited in 2006 to help WHO develop a template protocol on illicit trade in tobacco products. He also advised the Secretariat of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control on intergovernmental negotiations. He holds a master's degree in business administration with a specialization in public service from University of Birmingham, United Kingdom, and bachelor's degree in medicine from Maulana Azad Medical College, University of Delhi, India. Welcome, Dr. Prasad. And now I am pleased to hand over the further proceedings to the chairs, Dr. Joanna Kaun, Dr. Vanek Prasad. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Rana, and thank you to the union for putting together this really important workshop with fantastic speakers and panelists. We've got an excellent program for you. Really excited about this topic. We can tell people not to be using tobacco products, but if they are available wherever you go to purchase your milk or your gas, or you're seeing it, in your daily lives, and it's right there, that's a problem. And we have to be addressing the supply side of tobacco. And I know we're going to be getting into the rationale of vendor licensing in a moment, but I just want to thank you all for joining, and I'm honored to be co-chairing this with Dr. Prasad. We're going to begin by introducing the speakers in this first half of the workshop. So I'm going to jump in first, and then Dr. Prasad will continue with the introductions. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nidhi Sejpal Puranik. She is a medical doctor by background with postgraduate education in public health. She has close to 10 years of progressive work experience in healthcare programs management, program implementation and coordination, and capacity building. In her present capacity, she's working as a senior technical advisor of tobacco control at the International Union Against Tuberculosis and Lung Disease in New Delhi for the Global Implementation Program in India. She works in close coordination with the government, with NGOs, with local partners, and with civil society organizations to advance tobacco control initiatives at the national and subnational levels. She is the focal point for strengthening implementation and enforcement of TAPS bans, with a specific focus on point of sale through tobacco vendor licensing. So welcome, Dr. Puranik. Our next speaker is going to be Mr. Pranay Lal. Pranay Lal is a biochemist by training and works in the area of public health. He has worked on tobacco control in India for 20 years. He is currently a senior technical advisor at the International Union Against Tuberculosis and Lung Disease in New Delhi, where he works on advancing tobacco control at national and subnational levels. Prior to being at the union, Pranay worked towards designing effective HIV vaccines with the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. He has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals on a range of issues. He's a true Renaissance man. He's published on health, ecology, global trade, and infectious diseases. So welcome, Mr. Lal. And I'd also like to introduce Dr. Patrick Musavoli, who's technical officer in the Development Assistance Team of the Convention Secretariat. The Development Assistance Team provides technical advice and support to all parties on the implementation of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and the protocols, with a particular focus on supporting low and middle income countries with their implementation efforts. Prior to joining the Convention Secretariat, Patrick worked with various institutions and organizations, including the Framework Convention Alliance and the WHO Afro region. In recognition of his accomplishments in the African region, Patrick received the WHO World No Tobacco Day Award. And Patrick holds a master's in public health. So welcome, Dr. Musavoli.
Thank you, Joanna. And thank you, colleagues and Dr. Rana ji for the introduction. I'm happy to be here with Joanna to moderate this session. So in this first half, we will also have number of country level speakers, because ultimately it boils down to looking at opportunities, challenges in terms of vendor licensing. Does it really work? Is it something we should be focusing on as a subset of tobacco control measure? And why? Why not? So I think those are questions we need to look at. I'm trying to provoke the audience to think a little harder on some of these issues, but I'm sure we will hear from a number of our country presentations. And we will start with Dr. Ole Dudin, who is from Ukraine, is currently the Chief Specialist of Behavioral Risk Factors at the Public Health Center in the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, with more than 6 years of experience in developing legislation and providing expertise on the documentation about food safety, tobacco control, and other EU-related legislations. He has been the National Coordinator for Tobacco Control for MOH Ukraine, and has also served as an advisor to the Minister of Health of Ukraine in 2018-19. He's a national expert on deinstitutionalization of orphanages in Ukraine. And we welcome Dr. Dudin, along with Dr. Ryan Kennedy from the US, who is a PhD tobacco control researcher, who most of you know, associate professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Ryan has a lot of interest in role policy plays in addressing the global tobacco epidemic. And he's worked in low and middle income countries on different regulatory domains, including on tax ban related issues, health warning labels, and clean air. So in the US, Ryan has a program of research with the US FDA, Center for Tobacco, and which has been funded to the Hopkins CRSI to understand the role of e-cigarettes. And I think that would be also very interesting to see how novel and emerging products could be also regulated, if possible, through the vendor licensing scheme. And additionally, Ryan also oversees the global policy scan of how countries are regulating these products. So it will be good to hear from him. And then we will hear from Bangladesh, from Mr. Saeed Mahbubul Alam, the technical advisor to the union. He's a public health expert and an environment policy lawyer, and he's worked on policy advocacy issues for over 19 years. And he's currently the technical advisor for the union in Bangladesh. And throughout his career, he has supported and in the tobacco control legislation and policy development space. He's worked as a legal expert on tobacco control laws in various drafting committees of Ministry of Health of Bangladesh, holds an LLM from the World University of Bangladesh, actively supports CSOs on urbanization, transportation, child women's rights issues, water economics, and social justice related issues. And he's received the global leadership in tobacco control course from Johns Hopkins. So it's a handful. So we have really got good feedback going to come from Bangladesh. And then we will hear from Dr. Minazul Siraz. Minaz is currently serving in the federal government of Pakistan, the Ministry of National Health Services, Regulation and Coordination, as the Executive Director of the Pakistan Institute of Medical Sciences in Islamabad. He has more than 10 years of experience in tobacco control policy, planning, and implementation. And since 2019, he has successfully spearheaded the Tobacco Smoke-Free Cities project in Islamabad, which has now been replicated in 11 other districts across Pakistan. Overall, Dr. Shiraz's tobacco control work has continuously revolved around developing a strong network of energized forces at local, national, and international levels. He's a trained ophthalmologist, So we'll really get to hear from him and in terms of his experience from Pakistan. And then finally, we'll hear from Mr. Deepak Mishra from India, who's the Executive Director with Socio-Economic and Educational Development Society, commonly known as SEEDS in New Delhi. Deepak ji has over 25 years of experience in development management, research, capacity building, and training. And he's been involved in tobacco control program for more than a decade, with strong focus on supporting government, especially at the subnational level, in implementation of the COTPA 2003, the Tobacco Law of India, and looking at different policy decisions, especially on banning of pan masala and smokeless tobacco in a number of Indian states such as Bihar and Jharkhand. So I would welcome all five of you, and it will be really interesting to see how the global and the national level experiences provide guidance in moving on the space of tobacco vendor licensing. Back to you, Joanna.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vanek. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. Our first speaker is Dr. Nidhi, talking about the significance of tobacco vendor licensing, why we should be thinking about this issue and working on it actively. So over to you, Dr. Nidhi.
Respected chairs, thank you for that very gracious and kind introduction and welcome. Respected distinguished guests, speakers, colleagues, and participants. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this critical deliberation and sharing my thoughts on significance of tobacco vendor licensing, which can potentially be a good tool to advance the existing tobacco control measures across countries. Also briefly, letting me give a snapshot on the global approaches that are being implemented across the world. I have no conflict of interest to report. As Dr. Rana also very rightly highlighted in his talk, we all would agree that the wide availability of tobacco products throughout the world through the unregulated point of sales leads to the easy access and availability of tobacco products, especially to the youth and children. We would also agree a dedicated license for the tobacco sales in order to be also another perspective. Without a complete database which businesses are actually selling tobacco products is not just to fully implement, but also enforce not just the youth access laws, but also the other comprehensive laws that are in place. Looking at the literature research, the tobacco benefits the benefits of tobacco vendor licensing can broadly be categorized into three subheads. The first one is that it can help in reducing the availability
I think.
Ma'am, I think you have mute yourself.
Dr. Nidhi, you are mute.
You're muted and we can't see your screen anymore.
Am I visible now?
You're visible, but the presentation is not in sharing mode. Would you like me
Yes.
to share?
Is this visible now?
It's coming. Yes, it is now.
My apologies, we had a power cut down in my place. So as I was explaining, the literature review shows that the benefits of having tobacco vendor licensing can broadly be classified into three subheadings. Firstly, it can help us in reducing the accessibility and the availability of the tobacco products. And it can help us in doing so by not only just reducing the number of the vendors, but it can also help us in reducing the density of the vendors within a particular jurisdiction or within a particular community. It can also help us in banning the sale of tobacco products within specific retailer types, such as the grocery stores, the petrol pumps, the stationery stores, the convenience stores, so on and so forth. It can also help us in regulating the location of the tobacco retailers, that is specifically related to youth frequented areas or in and around educational institutions. The second benefit of having this policy introduced is that it can help in complying with the already existing tobacco control laws. It can help us in strengthening and complementing the youth access laws. It can help in preventing the taps in retailer spaces. It can help in banning the sale of loose or single sticks in these point of sales. It can also help us in eliminating the illicit or counterfeit tobacco products through the mechanism of tracking and tracing. By this mechanism, the government can have an exact idea as to which tobacco products, whether the excise duty has been stamped, whether illicit tobacco products are into the market circulation. And the third and the most important benefit of having this particular policy measure introduced in a particular jurisdiction is that it helps in generating revenue and creating a self-financing mechanism which can help in not only supporting the other public health initiatives, but it can also help in taking care of the administrative costs and also supporting the enforcement drives conducted for vendor licensing. So briefly moving into the next part, which is to give a snapshot of the global practices pertaining to vendor licensing. I'm happy to share that the literature research shows that approximately 22 countries across the globe have implemented tobacco vendor licensing in some or the other form, out of which 7 countries currently have national level. 5 of the countries have it at a subnational level. Looking at vendor licensing, which is used as a multi-pronged approach to advance the tobacco control strategies across various countries. Now, vendor licensing is either used as a single approach or is used in combination in any of the 3 approaches, as you can see on your screen. Many countries are using it to reduce the retailer density and also putting a number on cap of the number of the licenses that are issued by the authorities per year. Many countries are using it for restricting the type of point of sales. For example, restricting the sale of tobacco products in convenience stores, in pharmacies, in gas stations, so on and so forth. Many countries are using it to restrict the location of the retailers, to prohibit them within, say, 50 yards or say 100 yards of educational institutions, as in case of India, or within 500 feet or 1,000 feet of educational institutions in other countries, even restricting them in youth frequented areas, community health centers, religious places, so on and so forth. Quickly, briefly highlighting the countries that use vendor licensing to reduce the vendor density. Now, there are multiple countries that are using it in this fashion, but I'll quickly just highlight only few pertinent examples. The very first one is the country of Hungary that introduced this legislation in the year 2013 and was able to reduce the tobacco vendor density from almost 42,000 retailers across the country to a mere 7,000 tobacco retailers. Another pertinent country is the example of Canada. And in Canada, just quickly highlighting the example of province of Quebec that went ahead to reduce the 19,500 tobacco retailers in the province in the year 2003 to a mere 7,500 in the year 2006. They further went ahead to introduce the prohibition of tobacco sales in mobile vendors, restaurants, and in bars. Similarly, looking at the example of Finland, they also went ahead to drastically reduce the tobacco retailers from 30,000 in the year 2009 to 10,000 retailers in 2010. They also emphasized on introducing or using vendor licensing as a tool to reduce the illegal sale of tobacco to the minors. Another similar example is that of Scotland, that also went ahead to drastically reduce the tobacco vendor density. And another one is that of USA in New York City, where a cap was introduced to ensure that only 50% of the original number of the existing tobacco retailers were given license in a particular year. And this particular measure led to 11% decline in the tobacco vendor density. Looking at some of the countries that have used this measure to reduce the availability and accessibility of tobacco products to minors, we have almost 8 countries that have used this concept to strengthen the youth access laws and ensure that the tobacco products are not being made available to children who are below 18 years of age. We also have governments across the world from 5 countries, that is Thailand, Vietnam, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, that have used the lens of tobacco vendor license to control a proliferation of the tobacco outlets, focusing particularly on informal vending channels such as mobile vendors and street vendors. Then we also have about 11 countries across the world, that is Bulgaria, Ireland, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Australia, Norway, Singapore, Canada, USA, and Thailand, that have used this particular lens in ensuring that the location of the tobacco vendors, especially not just the educational institutions, but also certain countries have focused on ensuring that one vendor is located at a specific distance from the arms, less for the children. Then we have another example wherein vendor licensing is being used as a lens to ensure that there is a self-financing mechanism in place. And almost 4 countries across the world, Pakistan, France, Italy, and Spain, are utilizing the measure of vendor licensing in order to ensure that the revenue generated by this particular measure is utilized for other public health concerns, and also to cover tobacco vendor licensing is also being utilized as a potential strategy for many other purposes, such as reducing illegal sales. We have almost 5 countries across the world that are using it for this particular purpose. Then we also have about 9 countries that are utilizing the tobacco vendor licensing lens to ensure that the youth are prevented from uptaking the smoking behavior. Countries of USA, Canada, Australia, Hungary, Finland, Australia, Ireland, and Thailand have put in place these measures. We also have a few other countries that have utilized this particular lens to ensure they limit the point of sale advertisement and product placement so that it can deter the children from being attracted towards trying these lethal tobacco products. Also, we have 6 countries, Pakistan, Canada, USA, Singapore, and Ireland, that are using this to restrict the sale of loose or single sticks. We also have few countries that are utilizing tobacco vendor licensing to limit the electronic sale of cigarettes. So in summary, this was just to give you a brief snapshot of the global approaches that are utilizing tobacco vendor licensing to advance the tobacco control measures in respective countries. So in summary, it is a good measure which not only helps in reducing the accessibility and the availability, but also helps in strengthening the other existing tobacco control laws in place. So that is all that I wanted to share in a brief, and I thank the chairs for giving me this opportunity and having a patient listening. So these are some of the references, and that is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nidhi. What a fantastic way to start off this workshop of explaining the benefits of tobacco vendor licensing, all the precedents that have happened so far and the approaches that they've taken. So a terrific start to this, to the workshop and giving us the broad context. So thank you. And now I'd like to pass it over to Mr. Pranay Lal to share with us what we can learn from other sectors with respect to vendor licensing. Pranay, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. I just wanted to make sure whether my screen is visible. It should be up now.
Yes.
Is my screen visible? Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Nidhi. You made my task very easy. By giving in the elements of what would make for a successful vendor license. I'm going to talk about the experiences of vendor licensing in general in India, and then segue into what tobacco control can learn from vendor licensing of other sectors. I would like to declare that I have no conflicts of interest. I do not benefit directly or indirectly from tobacco industry. Just wanted to give you a brief history of vendor licensing in tobacco sector. Well, there are a number of jurisdictions, as Dr. Nidhi has shared in her presentation, but the oldest licensing systems come from state monopolies, starting with France and Spain and Italy. Other countries, Portugal had it till 1911, and then it dissolved it. As you know, Portugal was the port which actually brought the tobacco leaf to the world. It introduced it from the old world to the new world. So that's a country that had dissolved its vendor licensing policy. Among the most scientific rationales that have been incorporated by and large has been seen in states of Australia. And we see this growing in its stringency, and we see very stringent tobacco vendor licensing policies in Finland, Singapore, certain states in the United States, for example, New York and California, they have pretty good vendor licensing policies, and they're pretty robust. And there are certain counties which have had historically a very good vendor licensing policy, for example, Pennsylvania and Ohio, among others. Just wanted to highlight something that Dr. Nidhi also shared in her presentation. The city of San Francisco has a restriction on the number of vendor licenses that it would give based on the density of people and an area. And it also has prescriptions of how vendors would be located in and around schools. And I think Dr. Nidhi shared the example of Hungary and how it actually aimed to look at reducing the density of vendors while not compromising on the revenues that the government was getting from tobacco sales. I just wanted to show you these two licenses. The one on the left is from the state of Tennessee, which shows that a tobacco dealer's permit has been given by the Department of Finance and Taxation. Now, this is dated April 30th, 1953, which is right on top. If you were to look at on the right, the one on the left is for the state of Tennessee. The one on the right is from the Ole County of Pennsylvania, and this is from the year 1948. And it's been given specifically to Hilton and Laurent, which I think is a vendor, a tobacconist there. What it specifies, both of these, that it is going to be monitored and the revenues collected from a specific, through a specific license fee. And this needs to be deposited at a specific time for its renewal. And it also gives conditions on how the fee rates are going to increase year on year. Just wanted to show that if you were to look at products that are licensed across in various sectors, and if you were to look at South Asia, I think this would be very similar in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and even Nepal. Guns are centrally controlled. That means a national policy dictates how guns are going to be sold or how they're going to be traded across borders. And it's up to the chief executive officer of the district, the smallest unit of administration, who's going to decide on how the licenses have to be given to these points of sale, which will be selling the regulated guns, but also licenses for buyers of these guns, and under what conditions can an individual purchase a gun. So there are licenses on both ends. It requires very strict certification, and this includes renewal of the certification from the district collector. That's the official's name, the chief executive officer in a country like India. And you need various levels of certification, including medical and police certification. Then there's fertilizers and chemicals. Of course, this is largely driven by the state's agricultural policy, depending on the crops that you grow. But the critical thing here is that certain pesticides and fertilizers have now entered a restricted list. Ammonium nitrate, for example, which is used as an explosive. For those of you who remember the tragedy of the hotel in Beirut, is a case in point. And of course, there are quantity restrictions and specific seasons in which they can be sold, and those kind of specifications are also given. Petroleum and natural gas is very strictly monitored and regulated and sold. The price regulation is very, very strict. It changes on a daily basis in countries like India in particular. And this is a tender-based sale, quite like alcohol. And the specification in petroleum and natural gas is, of course, there are clearances that you need, especially from the explosives license perspective. That means you cannot have a similar product being sold in which there can be explosive event. They can also be from the point of retail. No person can buy or sell or do an open sale of petroleum or natural gas in India. What it means is that if I have a container and I want to fill it up with my jerry can or a bottle, you really need to, the petrol pump, the gas station has the right to refuse that sale. Alcohol also is regulated by state. Now, this is going to be very important for us if we really want to understand the logic of why alcohol is regulated at the state level and tobacco is regulated at the central level. And I'll come to that in a minute. Alcohol is taxed at the state level in India because the alcohol lobby said that unlike tobacco, alcohol is extremely dangerous for people and it's injurious to health and causes accidents, and it leads to several other social problems as well. By the time when tobacco and alcohol taxation was being discussed, harms of tobacco and the health implications of tobacco use were not widely known, at least not publicly. And in the 1950s, the government of India decided to give states the direct control on alcohol and tax it to the highest possible level so that it can control through taxation, but also regulate by purchasing and delivering and distribution and licensed sale. All of this was done through the state apparatus. On the other hand, tobacco was made open because it was considered safe, and the central government and the state government both realized that this is an opportunity not only to increase revenues, but also improve employment. So everybody was actually encouraged to make tobacco products available, not only through dedicated tobacco vends, but also make it available through other shops. And as a result, the dedicated tobacco vendor legislations that India and Pakistan had at one time, for example, the Punjab Vends Act, which is still applicable in Pakistan, but has been repealed in India. And the same thing happened in Madras and the presidencies of Madras and Bengal and Bombay, where the Tobacco Vends Act were repealed. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that while at one level, alcohol has a very strict provision of control and revenue garnering done through the state, tobacco was made available across the country, and it became available just at every point of sale in India. Medicines is another case in point that, there are levels of restrictions both at the center and state level. There's strong licensing of products like codeine and opioids, which can be addicting. Although there's weak implementation on licensing, but there are prescriptions on who can start a pharmacy and who can sell medicine in India. And it's usually done against a prescription, especially of dangerous drugs. I'm just going to leave you with some images of how licenses look like from other trades, because this is important if we are looking at creating a licensing system for tobacco. Now, a pharmacy, you can see on the left, it has a photograph. The person whose photograph appears is somebody who has a degree in pharmacy. And, and there's certain restrictions that are mentioned here. The state from where the pharmacy license is procured is displayed prominently. On the center, you've got the a license for a pesticide seller, of pesticide and fertilizer seller. That person is also an authorized pesticide formulator and a person who can apply it on field. So what is called an applicator. So because pesticides can be extremely dangerous, they are professional applicators. And for pesticides like Roundup, for example, if those of you who know the history of First World War, Zyklon B, which was developed by Fritz Haber, extremely toxic pesticide, is something that is sold through this license. And finally, on the right, you see an alcohol license, which is to be displayed quite prominently. This is from the state of Goa. But licenses, as I mentioned, can be licensed for, or a permit, as it's called, for an individual, is something that our society has seen for a very long time. When our grandparents or parents had transistors or radiograms, I don't know what they are called now, they were licenses that we had to take from the postal office, the post offices. And it was an annual process. It started with 7 rupees in 1952. And till 1978, it had become 100 rupees. So it was an incremental growth that happened year on year. It was a national fee. If you wanted to own a diode run radio or a television license, you had to pay a fee. Similarly, cycle owners in India and including Britain, much of the the British Empire, you had, if you were a cycle owner, you had a license, and this is a license that was in Gujarat till the year of 1975. Arms owners, as I mentioned, also have an annual inspection and a fee that they need to deposit. Alcohol permits are given to individuals in places where alcohol sale, trade, or even use is banned, but they can get it through a tourist permit. And this is a very, very expensive license and a very cumbersome procedure. If you really want to drink in a place where alcohol is not welcome or is not being sold openly, it's still made available by the government of India. So this is my final slide. I won't bear too much on what Dr. Nidhi's already spoken about, but just to summarize, wherever we find a good control of the government in terms of restricting and controlling sale of legitimate products and reducing or eliminating illicit trade, the lessons that are drawn are as follows. Licenses typically should be population-based, and the authority that gives the license should look at how many adult users exist in a place or a single region. For example, in the city of Delhi, if you have 100,000 people, one alcohol vend is given. So if we were to do something like this for tobacco, that would be useful, and a dedicated vend at that. Or you could look at every market. I mean, that would make it simpler, that you have it based on boroughs and wards or any other criteria which divides the municipal corporation or the city. And the license fee should be technically, in India, the lowest level of license is called an L1 license of liquor, which is actually different for different jurisdictions. It could be a very high in the states of Kerala or Delhi or Punjab, but very low in states where alcohol consumption is low. So it's based on a percentage of the estimated revenues made in the previous year or the anticipated revenues in the coming years. Like Dr. Nidhi said, compliance to all forms of laws, domestic, national, and local, have to be maintained. One of the important things, especially in alcohol, which is seen in India, is sale restrictions on particular days. For example, the birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, alcohol shops are closed, but tobacco shops are open. So that is quite paradoxical because Mahatma Gandhi hated tobacco. So one of the reasons why addictive products like tobacco should also be stopped on those days is there should be a sales restriction, and there should be an opening and closing time, because currently tobacco shops can be open all night and nobody's there to stop you. And of course, like I mentioned, it should be exclusive sales shop. Like in alcohol in India, you don't have sale of other products, other eateries or any other things, especially savories. And so for tobacco, which as you notice from images from the South Asia region, tobacco products are sold alongside candy and biscuits and water and chocolates. And finally, display of the license should be in a prominent place so that we have, if a consumer or a non-consumer has a complaint against the vend, that can be made to the authorities. And finally, of course, the ultimate aim is to regulate the number of vends that are making tobacco products available, reduce the number of violations that occur currently at the points of sale. With that, I'd like to thank the organizers of this workshop and look forward to listening to the other speakers. Thank you so much.
That's fantastic, Pranay. Fascinating presentation, and really appreciated you showing us pictures of the different licenses, exactly what we're talking about. It's helpful to see them in real life. That's terrific. And I think also it was helpful to hear, the different levels, whether it was central or state level in India, where different types of products were. Thank you. And hearing, because countries can decide, at what level it's regulated. And of course, there's advantages and disadvantages at the different levels. So thank you so much for giving us that really big picture perspective, very helpful. And so next, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Patrick Musavoli to talk to us and provide an overview of Article 6, the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products. So over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joanna. I don't know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. So let me just go directly to my presentation. Dear colleagues and valued partners, greetings to everyone. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here with you today for this session workshop on tobacco vendor and licensing. So I'm Patrick Musavoli, a technical officer working at the Convention Secretariat. And as Joanna said, my task today is to provide you with an overview of the Article 6 of the protocol. I have no conflicts of interest to report. So before going any further with Article 6 of the protocol, let's just remind ourselves what is the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products in a nutshell. I will start by saying that last month on 25th of September, we celebrated the 3 years anniversary of the entry into force of the protocol. And counting 64 parties from all regions, the protocol is a treaty in its own right, reaffirming the rights, the key element of Article 15 of the WHO FCTC, but going much further. The protocol commits parties to the objective of eliminating all form of illicit trade in tobacco products and empowers them with legal tools to do so. As you know, illicit trade has a negative impact on public health, government finances, and security. And I will get back to these 3 elements at the end of my presentation. So how does the protocol work? The protocol has 3 substantive parts, and at the heart of the protocol, we have a measure to secure the supply chain of tobacco products. The most popular is the establishment of a global tracking and tracing regime, but we also have among these preventive measures, we have license, which is the subject of this workshop. So license is part of the measure that parties need to put in place to secure the supply chain of tobacco products. The other element or substantive part of the protocol deals with law enforcement. So it forces measures related to offenses such as establishing unlawful conduct, providing for liability, including criminal liability, prosecution, and dissuasive sanctions. And finally, we have a key group of substantive articles that address the issue of international cooperation, which will enable, of course, parties to share information and cooperate in technical, administrative, and legal matters. So now touching the Article 6 of the protocol itself, it is for those who have had a chance to look at the Article 6 in the protocol, it is divided into 5 main points with, of course, several subpoints. But let's just say that Article 6.1 requires party to make the manufacturer, import, and export of tobacco products and manufacturing equipment subject to a license. So it's not just a product, but that's list. And you can really see it in the protocol. Other activities such as growing tobacco and transporting and wholesaling tobacco products should be also licensed where it is possible, taking into consideration national circumstances. And this one, you see it under Article 6.2. We also have under Article 6.3 different points, and the first one, 6.3a, this article required to establish and designate a competent authority or authorities that will be able to issue, to renew, to suspend, to revoke, or cancel licenses. We've just heard from the example of India that we can have, the license issued either at a central level or state level. So it depends. We have also seen in some countries where this is done by only the Ministry of Finance, but in some countries it is done by both Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Health. Article 6.3b, here it's really important because if a party to the protocol is able to implement that parties, it's really interesting. You will be able to collect essential information about the applicants. And here the protocol gives you what you really need to collect. If it is, if the applicant is a natural person, information regarding or identity, including the full name, the trade name, business registration number, and any other information will be taken at this moment. So when somebody comes and requests a license, this is an opportunity to get the necessary information. And the Article 6.3b gives you all kind of information that you need to get from that person. Article 6.3c indicates that license fees may be levied, and most importantly for us, in the current circumstances, it can be used for public health purpose. So this is something very interesting. We heard Dr. Dini talking about this. So let's keep in mind that we can use license fees not only for administration purpose, but we can also use it for public health. Article 6.4 is also very important, and it says no license shall be assigned or transferred without prior approval from the competent authority and receipt of appropriate information. And Article 6.5 indicates that 5 years after the entry into force of the protocol, the meeting of the party will take action to identify any key inputs that are essential to manufacture the tobacco product. So I will quickly go into the importance of the protocol. So illicit trade increases the affordability and availability of tobacco products, as we all know, as this product often escaping product regulation attract the youth and the poor. It is these vulnerable groups that are most impacted. In the context of government struggling to respond to or recover from COVID-19 pandemic, such loss, because the government lose a lot of money, such loss of earning is considerable financial handicap. As we also know, illicit trade in tobacco products is jeopardizing a country's security, thriving on corruption, organized crime, and contributing to those phenomena like Not in the list, it's opened the opportunity to the tobacco industry to claim a seat at the policy making table as a partner in fight against illicit trade. In all, these consequences constitute a heavy toll upon countries engaged in tobacco control. Therefore, implementing the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products is an important piece of a comprehensive tobacco control approach that contributes to sustainable development agenda. As you can see, implementing the protocol will clearly have an impact on SDG 3, 8, and 16. Yeah, so let me just conclude by saying, I just went very quickly because most of the things I wanted to say were already covered. Let me just conclude by saying that the license should not be seen as a tool that gives permission to do business. It's important to understand that a license is an important tool to know and control the players, you know, and it's also a tool, a very important tool to obtain information about them, those players, in order to secure the supply chain of tobacco products. It is a powerful tool that can be used, as we said, to mobilize additional resources, specifically for public health and in the context where countries need more resources. This is something parties or countries need to take into consideration. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I would like to remind you that on Wednesday, 3rd of November, we are going to launch a global progress report on the implementation of the protocol. You will then be able to have some additional information on the implementation of Article 6. And I look forward to seeing you at the second session of the meeting of the party, which will be held in November. Thank you very much. And back to you, Chair.
Oh, thank you so much, Patrick. This is really helpful to hear how the FCTC supports vendor licensing. I learned a lot from your presentation, so it's definitely helpful to get into the specifics. It's not always the articles that we have tended to pay the most attention to, but really helpful to set the stage. So thank you so much. So now I'd like to pass it back to Vinayak to chair our country presentations.
Thanks, Joanna, and thank you. I think all these presentations are extremely helpful in trying to understand that what is the country level globally, what do we see happening at country level. And I think it's important to note, I mean, if I was to summarize it at this point, is looking at these experiences. It's possible to license. There is a logic to licensing for, let's say, for the protocol purposes, for other purposes. So what are the opportunities and challenges which the countries will face if they want to go ahead in that direction? And then are there impact assessments? I think those are important questions. So if the speakers from the countries are going to talk about this, so we know that it's possible to license. We know that it is something which has been experienced in many countries, but how does it work? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What's the impact? So let me therefore invite to begin with Mr. Duhin from Ukraine to share his experience from Ukraine. Over to you, Mr. Duhin.
Hello. 1 second. Good day, dear colleagues. Let me present the situation with the TVL in Ukraine. I have no conflict of interest to report. Legislation. There are 3 general legislation acts in Ukraine for TVL. It's tax code of Ukraine, which contains requirements for circulations of the accessible goods like tobacco, alcohol, and other. Establish the authorities and other. One specific law, it's about regulations of spiritus, tobacco, electronic cigarettes, and other. which contain definitions and price for license, and Code of Ukraine of Administrative Offenses. It's stamps, license, and other amount of fines. We have a type of licenses. The most expensive is license for tobacco wholesale, $500,000 hryvnia per year. And I don't know why, but we have a cheaper license for liquid for electronic cigarettes, wholesales near $30 per year, and production of tobacco and liquids, 30 USD per year. I think it's for free in Ukraine. Tobacco retail license, 2,000 hryvnias in city, and cheaper 10 times in rural territory. It's like $10 per year for license. After the collapse of Soviet Union, was banned the state monopoly for tobacco retail, and in 1992 was adopted the first document of tobacco vendor license in Ukraine, and first law was adopted in 1995, and now it's with changes is current. Last changes was 2 years ago. Were including the license for liquid for electronic cigarettes and other changes, and increasing of penalties for advantages of tobacco products licensing in Ukraine is mandatory of license, significant penalties for violations, ability to revoke the license, including for sale to children, issued for production, for wholesales and vendor retail in the shops, and we have one license for one point of retail in market. So in hypermarkets for Kassa. For all cases, we need one license. 2 years ago was changes about liquids for electronic cigarettes. It's very good for regional authorities. License help prevent illegal sales, but it's not work good. I will show you some photo. In the future, license system will help to develop trace and tracking. We have open register of license. Citizens can see the proof of license on the website of fiscal authorities, but this system is mixed with alcohol, cigarettes, and liquid for electronic cigarettes. It's very difficult to find what you want. Each box office. Problems. We have a problem with street trade and unknown tobacco products without акцизная марка. Without accesses from other country, from occupied territory, and it's very difficult to find a source of this violence. Protocol of eliminate illicit trade is not ratified now, but we tried 3 times to ratify, and some tobacco lobby blocked this document on the level of president administrations of previous power in Ukraine. General register mixed with tobacco, alcohol, and other. There are 20,000 of point of license. It's about problem. It's a photo of national police of Ukraine, cigarettes from Belarus and other countries. We don't know from what countries these products. Developed tracking system is needed. We need to increase price for license. We need to increase price for rural territory significance. I think this problem was considered 2 years ago to reobtain license after its revocation for gross violations like sale for children and price for cities and villages. Thank you for attention. These are current situations, and finally, I need to say that there are not enough attention for improving TVL in Ukraine in terms of public health situations. It's making by fiscal authorities and for budget of Ukraine, not for public health. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Duhin, for sharing your experience from Ukraine, the lessons which other countries can follow in terms of licensing, also the challenges, and also what steps you are considering to strengthen the existing licensing system. Just one question, because I know you need to go, is, and you also mentioned that it's been more of a revenue measure, less of a public health approach. What is the kind of consultation process you are following in Ukraine to get the health and the revenue colleagues to be fully involved so that you can move quickly in strengthening the licensing system? Mr. Duhin?
Thank you for questions. In first, we need to empower our authority like Public Health Center, like Ministry of Health. I think we need to do it in the frame of international projects or international support. And we had particularly trying to improve license situations in sphere of public health, like ban, for example, ban to the retail of cigarettes near the school, near the children place, but it was not complex work. It was idea of one of the parliamentary, of one of the representative of ministry. So we need to intersectoral support of these changes, and I think Public Health Center the most is the most stakeholder of this process in Ukraine.
Thank you. And I see a message also from Hannah Ross saying Ukraine has very good licensing system, but enforcement is lacking. So is there a plan to strengthen enforcement capacity in Ukraine on the licensing system? You're muted.
I think we need, maybe we need a national strategy but we have a national strategies for implementation. It's about illicit trade. It's not about tobacco vendor licensing in the sphere of for public health needed of Ukrainian. We can develop the change to the national strategy of illicit trade, and we will begin an intersectoral develop of activities for improving of TVL in Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Duhin, for your participation and all your inputs. And we really find that helpful. So it will be good if you can stay on here some of the other country presenters as well. So let's move on to Ryan to speak about the US experience.
Thank you, Dr. Prasad, and thank you, Dr. Duden. That was very interesting. I will just bring my screen up. And so I would just like to acknowledge that this is an area of tobacco control that is relatively new to me, but it is an area that I sincerely share the enthusiasm for, along with our colleagues today. I am going to, like Dr. Prasad said, share some of the insights from the United States. I'm Ryan Kennedy from the Institute for Global Tobacco Control, and that's my declaration or the conflict of interest disclosure form. So just quickly to touch on and remind us of the scale and scope of what we're dealing with in the United States, tobacco use continues to kill close to 500,000 people a year. And many, many more live with serious illness, and some of that is linked to, as well, exposure to tobacco smoke pollution. The impact on the economy is tremendous. This is often a powerful argument when we talk about some of these policy options that we have. Over $200 billion in direct medical costs is estimated to be the result of tobacco use. And we have seen declining prevalence rates across most groups in the US, but there are and continue to be remarkably deep disparities with some groups not benefiting from some of these national trends. So tobacco vendor licensing, or if folks are reviewing or looking up examples from the US, it's often called tobacco retailer licensing. It's a strategy that's fairly common across the United States. And it has had the benefit of some pretty powerful endorsements. The US Surgeon General in reports on the state of the epidemic in the US has presented this as a viable and important strategy to reducing the impacts from tobacco use, as well as the National Academy of Medicine. We've heard from Dr. Nidhi and others, some of the rationales are motivations for implementing tobacco vendor licensing. At a very basic level, it supports health authorities or local authorities to track the number of tobacco retailers, and certainly has been framed domestically in the US as a means to generate revenue, with the argument that some or all of that revenue could be put towards supporting tobacco control enforcement efforts, such as ensuring minimum age of purchase restrictions are enforced, and or other restrictions around claims or promotions. So those are some of the pragmatic benefits from a public health perspective, and this is something where the US has contributed some of the evidence base here, is that we know what and how high tobacco vendor density impacts tobacco use consumption. We know that higher tobacco vendor density is associated with greater tobacco use. We also know in the US that tobacco vendor density tends to be higher in more disadvantaged communities, communities with lower socioeconomic status, and in racialized communities, feeding into some of those disparities that I mentioned earlier. We also know that tobacco vendor licensing is, or tobacco vendors, we have done research sort of understanding proximity of tobacco vendors to populations, there have been a variety of studies demonstrating that for the majority of people in urban settings, for example, that in a short walk, you can purchase tobacco from many locations, including from schools. There's been a lot of work trying to understand location of vendors or density of tobacco vendors in and around environments where youth and young adults are likely to be, including school campuses. And of course, those are also environments where the tobacco industry and retailers take advantage of the situation in the US where promotion of products at the point of sale is still permitted. As a point of inspiration, there are a few jurisdictions in the world. There are very few jurisdictions in the world as litigious as the United States, I would say. And as I've shared here, there has been enough of this basic public health research to demonstrate the impacts of tobacco vendor licensing on use. And because of this basis or foundation of evidence, the legal opinions or advice that's often shared in the US to local authorities is that any of these possible policies or laws that could be implemented are unlikely to be rejected from constitutional challenges. So I think Nidhi had three broad strategies or rationales. In the US, we often talk about it in this context. Four approaches or strategies. We can use tobacco vendor licensing to impose minimum distances between retailers. And anyone that's familiar with different urban planning strategies, this is a technique or policy approach that's used across sectors. We have seen strategies that impose a capping on the number of retailers within a specific geographic region. Similarly, a cap on the maximum number of retailers proportional to the population. Pranay Lal was talking about some of those strategies as well. And finally, the idea of using licensing to restrict where tobacco can be sold based on certain types of establishments. And the example we've seen throughout the US is disallowing tobacco to be sold in places like pharmacies. So given all that evidence, where are we in the US? All the states and territories have the legal authority to require tobacco vendor licensing. There are approximately 380,000 tobacco retailers in the US. That sounds like a lot for me. I know in the context of jurisdictions like India, that maybe is not an impressive number, just by comparison. So in the US, 380,000 retailers, we have 6,000 Starbucks, 14,000 McDonald's, about 150,000 gas stations. And of those gas stations, 150,000, about 66,000 have convenience stores, which would very likely be selling tobacco products. So the point is that tobacco is everywhere. You think some of these other retail types would be as ubiquitous, but it pales in comparison for the availability of tobacco in the US. I mentioned that we've been doing a lot of research. Our colleagues, including Kurt Ribelsteel's team, looked at, did a very close look at 30 US cities and where and the location of tobacco retailers, and concluded that 70% of the people that were living in these 30 different markets, 30 different cities across the country, 70% of them could walk less than half a mile, so less than a kilometer, and find themselves at a tobacco retailer. Looking at this map, I've found this at the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention. There is a distinction here made in the coloring around e-cigarettes, which were deemed tobacco products in the US some years ago. So the jurisdictions that are colored orange, that's 9 states and 3 territories, they, within those jurisdictions, those states and territories, retailers are required to have a vendor license to sell tobacco products other than e-cigarettes. The jurisdictions colored red, that's 29 states, the District of Columbia, and the remaining 3 territories. In those jurisdictions, you're required to have a vendor license to sell either conventional tobacco products or e-cigarettes, which leaves the yellow jurisdictions, which is 12 states and 1 territory, that did not require at the state level or territory level tobacco vendor licensing. And this includes some of the states with the highest prevalence of tobacco use, including Kentucky, Michigan, and Missouri. So I'm going to briefly share one example of tobacco vendor licensing that has been evaluated. As you can imagine, a lot of the policy innovation here is happening at city level. I'm going to share some insights from our colleagues at the city of Philadelphia, a large city on the East Coast. It was determined that the health department in Philadelphia had they were trying to understand and get a handle on their tobacco epidemic in the city, and they determined that they had about double the number of tobacco retailers per 1,000 population compared to nearby cities such as New York. Nationally, only a handful of jurisdictions have any one of the sort of 4 policy approaches that I shared. Philadelphia, in their implementation, tried to deploy all of those. And so I'm referencing some of the work that was just published in 2020, and I'll share the reference there too. But using city licensing data, Philadelphia researchers and practitioners sought to evaluate the impacts on district level tobacco retailer density, tobacco retail exposure within 500 feet of schools, and how this policy impacted access, considering different socioeconomic differences. And they did this using a variety of strategies. Vendors were grandfathered and fees were increased from $50 US. I don't have one of the licenses today, unfortunately, but they increased from 50, which is less than $1 a week, to $300, which still seems a little bit low in my books. But the penalties for youth sales were standardized and increased, and after a 3rd violation, the vendors would lose their licenses. So different strategies to sort of make it a little bit more difficult to hold a license, and deeper consequences if people were not following general tobacco control rules. And so briefly, I'm not going to go through in great detail, but the prior to regulations, the city had been seeing a steady increase in the number of retailers, especially near schools, around a 4% increase per year. And looking at the number of retailers near schools following the implementation, there was a 22% reduction of retailers. So Dr. Prasad was wondering, do we have evidence that these sorts of policies work? In Philadelphia, it worked along this dimension: 300 fewer retail exposures. Again, similar to the trend near schools, tobacco vendor density generally in Philadelphia had been increasing. And after the advances in their tobacco vendor licensing policy, vendor density showed over 20% reduction 3 years after implementation. And I just want to say the city of Philadelphia was very conscious of helping retailers through this. I think this was an important aspect of the strategy, helping retailers diversify some of the products and services that they provided. Briefly as well, we talked about pharmacies being a strategy of not allowing vendor licensing for retail settings such as pharmacies. San Francisco was the first US city to ban sales in these environments. We had our first national chain. CVS is a national pharmacy, and they decided to stop selling tobacco products. We're still working on some of the other chains. And Massachusetts, which is a very interesting state, it has hundreds of local authorities. Over 80 of them have enacted similar bans to San Francisco. So I'll end there, and that's my contact information, and some of the useful references and resources are here.
Thank you, Ryan. Lots of new things I have learned today. US Surgeon General's report, to the evidence of the impact of this work. It reduced vendor access, leads to better tobacco control. All that are good set of measures. And I think we should definitely find time to discuss what's preventing so many states from adopting this at some stage, because you also showed the divergence and the failed states, if I am permitted to use those words, then failed states versus champion states, and what's preventing scale up at different state level. Let's move on quickly to see how some of the LMICs are doing. So we start with Bangladesh, and I would like to invite Mr. Saeed Alam to share his experience.
Thank you, Chair. I have no conflict of interest. So Dr. Nidhi very clearly shared the background that why the license is important. So Bangladesh experience is that we are learned that why the licensing on the base of our practical experience. When 2019, the BI initiative started in Bangladesh, mainly our work with the local government on smoke-free and tobacco law implementation. Most of the CSO organization working to smoke-free law implementation and tax ban protection. So we found that there is a challenging thing that one tobacco selling are everywhere, and the vendors are used by the tobacco industry for their promotional activities. So that is our thought, and we start thinking how to control the things. In 2016, the AID Foundation, one of the CSO and funded by the Bloomberg Initiative, they start working with the 18 municipalities in 55 city corporation in 22 districts to introduce the vendor licensing. Initially, it was a very challenging thing. However, we motivated few of the mayors and the city corporations. They start introduce the licenses. So it's a very minimum number of things. And Manipganj, one of the small municipality in Bangladesh, they are the first started the licensing. So, but most of the municipalities, those are working on law implementation, they are focused on the smoke-free. So we are start thinking how we can bring them all that together. In Bangladesh, more than 300 municipalities, and there is a more city corporation. So we are start thinking that how we can bring all them together. So this is our background. Then we generate the evidence. When we start working with the 18 municipalities, we found that most of the municipalities, there is 100% tobacco seller who are selling tobacco product. Most of them has no license. They have no license. They don't know about the licensing. And when we discuss with them, we find that they are more than 60%, around the 60%, they are want to have a license for continuing their business. And vendor also have different type. That is the one thing what I discussed, that one when we're going to work on the tax ban provision. This is the one challenging thing that the most of the vendor are used by the industry for the campaign and they are receiving different type of promotional gift from the tobacco industry. And in Bangladesh, there is a different type of vendors. Some are fixed and some are floating. So people are moving around with the tobacco products. So, however, that after a long work, that some of the municipalities, as there's a different opinion for the implement TC law and introduce licensing, then based off our experience, mainly two CSU, lot of CSU working, but the Dhaka Ascent Mission, AID Foundation, the two groups are actively work with the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Local Government to introduce a national guideline. And Ministry of Health took lead and motivate the Ministry of Local Government to develop national level guideline for the TC law implementation. So Ministry of Law established a committee and prepared a draft guideline under the Municipality and City Corporation Act. So this policy document cover a lot of things. Introduce it is including tobacco control law implementation, funding for tobacco control in the municipality level, vendor licensing, awareness, formulation and monitoring and implementation. So this is a comprehensive document we received. This is a complete document. So when we started the things, again, I want to mention that one, the vendor license who are selling the tobacco products in Bangladesh, they are moving everywhere. A lot of people are there. It is very difficult to track. So we develop apps and we try to generate evidence. So there's a Gram Bangla Unnayana Committee. They develop an online surveillance system and monitoring apps. And we find first time we identify in the one of the division, we identify the 21,000 tax violation, 6,000 PSO, and reported submitted to the tax percent. So we generated evidence that how many tobacco violation there and how many vendors there. So the apps help us to get information how many the vendor location, business pattern, is a shop or is a small shop, or it is a individual person who moving with the small setup for the tobacco vendor and other things. So this is the thing. So this is a good example to collect the evidence. And now there's the union other grantees in the three division, the 8 Foundation, NATAP, and Gram Bangla. They are also following the same thing. So now we have in the three division we have the very good data in the ministry related, how many vendors is there, how they are operating their business, how many people have the licensing, and how those people have no license. Most of the people have no license, and only the few shops, they are like a grocery shop. They also grocery license, but they also operating business for tobacco licensing. But as per the guideline that if you are selling tobacco, so you need to get a license for, you need a separate license. So what we did, now we come for the implementation. As I said that one of the things that this is the digital database help us to motivate the policymakers that to show that the evidence, the law violation, and the scenario of the tobacco selling. One of the very important things that I would like to mention that most of the tobacco vendors we found nearby the schools. And one of the municipality mayor shared with us that he received a lot of phone call and pressure that he has to issue license nearby the school. He should not stop it. But as per the local government guideline, within the 100 meter of the school, there is the municipality cannot issue any license. So this is the one. So, however, lockdown one of the challenge for us. But during the lockdown, as I say that one, we collected data from all over the municipality areas, and this helped us to award the vendors to about the tobacco control law, also get the license from the municipality. So we shared when the database is prepared, we share this database with the local government authority and show them how much revenue they can earn from this licensing and how they can contribute for public health. The both things, not only the licensing, we also show that one. Again, I would like to remind that one in our tobacco control guideline, there is a clear direction that local government has to allocate funding for tobacco control. So tobacco control and public health. So we show them that you can collect the revenue from this side, and you can also spend this money for public health. So the evidence-based data help us to motivate the mayors that how much vendors are there, how many are they are not, they don't have the licensing, and how they can locate them. So this database we share with all the officers. So data also. Then, as I want to share that one very important thing, the Ministry of Local Government have the guideline in 2020, which came into force in March. And from the January, March, and still June, there's a lockdown, so we couldn't work very properly. There's a lot of challenge in this time due to the lockdown. Our civil society people are not able to move down. However, now we have the clear data for the 28 districts and their population, and we identified there's a 21,213 point of sale are available there, and till now 800 license issued. Some of the local government start working to cover all the licensing, but some are going to delay because there's some social pressure, and obviously the lockdown one of the major challenges. So now I would like to share the one challenge thing that now when we start the implementing this guideline, our civil society will still actively working with the local government to implement the guideline. So now we are getting pressure, especially the mayors and the other group, they're getting pressure from the tobacco industry to stop vendor licensing. Tobacco industry, especially the two giant companies there. One of the old company, BAT, they are started lobbying with the different ministry and officials, and also they are starting propaganda against the vendor licensing, and they are trying to stop this process. There is another challenge is that some people have misconception regarding the vendor licensing. Some people think that it may be regulating, it may be can be legalized this business, and it should not. So they are opposing that one. That is the some people mindset, and some local government leader thought that it may be burden for the small vendors. So the licensing for the small vendors is fees 500 taka, is very little money, but still we are facing that some local government leaders thought that it may be burden for that one. So in this situation, we have two clear achievement like that. One, we have very clear data how many vendors there. We provide already a list of list to the local government, how many vendors they already take license and who are not take license without their information, and how many money they can earn from this licensing. But still it's going very slow for the different reason. But we are afraid or little bit worried about, because industry starting this propaganda hugely that it can be hamper as poor people, or it is not implementable. So like that things. So now how to way forward? As I say that one lockdown, one of the challenging, now we are thinking to sustainable and implementing thing. We are working to inclusion guideline implementation of tobacco control law activities in the training curriculum of local government. In Bangladesh, there is a local government institute, National Institute for Local Government. We are working with them that they can include this tobacco control guideline in the training curriculum, that when the local government leader will be there, they can know it and they can implement it. We also think that the capacity building of the local government official is important to implement the guideline. For the licensing, there is for the issue the licensing, there is a 2% maybe in the local government very playing important role. One of the center inspector and one is the licensing officer. But most of the area is a very big, and there is a 2 officers are responsible. It's very difficult to for them to collect information and find them. Those are not following this law. So it's very difficult for them, but it's the human resources, the one of the things. But we are working to capacity building of the local government officials to implement the guideline. There is one of the committees called the Tobacco Control Task Force Committee, which committee is a common forum for the government officials, civil society, local government leaders, media, lawyers. So this task force committee is responsible for tobacco control law implementation. So we are encouraging the local government leaders to participate in this meeting. And most of the local government task force, this is headed by district commissioner. So they took decision that the licensing should implement it, and they are we are trying to that it will be a part of their meeting agenda. We are visiting local government. We think that we are central government monitoring. Ministry of Local Government has established a monitoring team to conduct their activities. So we are working with them to support their activities. So as I say, that one tobacco control agenda should be a monthly coordination meeting in the district head by the district commissioner. We are trying to do in the meeting. We are supporting that there is a mechanism in the guideline that people, if there is a violation, that people can complain by written and orally. So that we are working, that mechanism should establish. Local government, there is another provision that local government will allocate fund. Funding is one of the very important things for the monitoring licensing issue. Most of the time there is no funding, but recently few local governments start funding under the this guideline. So we are trying to support them to not only allocate funding, how to utilize this funding, and it should be utilized for the monitoring, for the licensing. So one of the things I would like to share that one. This is a very new thing for Bangladesh, and we are working in the local government. We have the 2 stand. Now we have the vendor listing. That is the one, I think, that very effective things for our Bangladesh. And second thing, the guideline. But we are also very carefully observe the industry propaganda, because they are very aggressively start working to stop this process. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Alam, for sharing the experience of Bangladesh, challenges of floating vendors versus the industry opposition. Of course, if industry is opposing, it means something is happening and it's working. So there's nothing to fear that part. Also to see that there is a balance which is being kept in terms of revenue potential versus public health approach. And very interesting to see that 60% of vendors want a license, even though they take free gifts from the industry, they want the license. And so again, what's going in the mind of the vendors to want a license? All very good points for discussion. We will have this opportunity to discuss. Let me quickly move on to Dr. Minaz Ussiraj to share experience from Pakistan.
Thank you very much, the honorable chairs, and all my worthy colleagues from all over the globe and the participants. So I hope my screen is visible.
Not yet.
Is it okay now?
No, we can't see it. Yes, it's coming. If you want to go in presentation mode.
So, or should I ask Miss Caroline to help me out?
You might want to go on the display setting on the top.
Yep.
The one after on your right. You have a little button called display settings.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to change the settings. Yes, now.
Now you can.
It works, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your help. So, starting with the scenario in Pakistan about this strengthening and advancing tobacco control through tobacco vendors licensing. I have no conflict of interest for this issue. And yes, I have the presenters have my consent to share whatever they want to. So starting from the Pakistan perspective, I would like to share the history of vent fee in the subcontinent and when we started launching this vendor licensing at the Islamabad Capital Territory. And on the right hand side, you can see for the specimen of the tobacco vendor license, which is being issued by our excise department, which is under the direct control of the district government. And but when we started this practice in the Islamabad Capital Territory, and we were going to enforce that, then we tried to invent a public health intervention into that, and that was in the form of a legal tool. Because here in the tobacco control, we have not public health intervention, the luxury of getting public health intervention in the form of medicines or drugs or experiments. So only the legal tools help the most. And then the outcomes on the disclosures of this initiative, which come along, and then the leadership matters and what the future holds for us, the tobacco control licensing in Pakistan. So coming to the history, when the subcontinent were ruled by the Britishers, they enacted a Tobacco Vendor Act in 1938. And let me remind you that's a subcontinent comprised of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh at that time. So these three countries have that legacy in common. And surprisingly, the preamble of that license said that it is promulgated in the interest of public health. The government or the Britishers, they knew already that the tobacco products are harmful for the public health. So they imposed a fine or a license fee for the people who wanted to sell that product. After 1947, when Pakistan came into being, the West Pakistan government adopted that licensing in 1958. And well, it was most of the tobacco production was focused in our northwest region. So the central Pakistan and the south never bothered about it. But when we started working on making Islamabad a smoke-free city in 2014, we came across these documents and we requested the district government to impose this licensing in the federal capital because the law was there. So we took on board all our stakeholders, and the excise department took lead on this licensing, and we involved the Chamber of Commerce and of course the trade unions also, because the retailers were going to be affected with this licensing. And then the education department, the main stakeholders, because in our tobacco control law, the main body, the section 9 of this law clearly states that there should be no tobacco selling point within the limits or outside the jurisdiction of any tobacco control. On any education institute, there should be no tobacco selling point. And the law enforcement coming from the district police and our field monitoring units also started to take part in this activity. So as you can see on the right hand side, this was a warning which was issued after about 3 years of soft implementation of this law. We carried out the mapping of the city retailers points for 3 months, and then when December 2015 this law was imposed in Islamabad, the licensing of the vendors started, but we were not coming harsh on the retailers. And as you can see, from 1st of January 2019, that was after almost 3 years of soft awareness campaigns and convincing those people that this will be useful for the public and we need to do this tobacco control for our smoke-free generations. So then after 3 years, the district government started harsh implication. And when I was talking about the public health intervention that came in the form of an affidavit, we drafted this affidavit, and whenever a tobacco retailer was applying to get a license, he had to give it on a judicial paper, the undertaking that I will abide by all the tobacco control laws of the country. And that meant that he will not sell it to under 18. He will not sell open or loose cigarettes. He will not sell illegal tobacco, and he will not sell it near the educational institutes. So you can see our excise teams, the director excise is rightly there, and they were starting this licensing on the spots. So when we started the outcomes, which we recorded over the years, that the first of the thing is that those shops, the premises, or the you can say the trade points, they were themselves, first of all, they were declared itself smoke-free premises. Then what the tobacco industry has always been avoiding to share with the government or the revenue departments, their density of the vendors, that became known in at least in Islamabad Capital Territory. And the volume of these sale points were assessed with the urban-rural divide, because the Islamabad Capital Territory has about more than 60% of rural area around it. And then there came the fiscal sustainability of tobacco control efforts, because when we started getting license fee from these vendors, then we earmarked the 50% of the revenue, annual revenue, for our tobacco control efforts to sustain these activities when the donors input for these activities will be phasing out. So another major outcome was that the small vendors, if there was a market set up and there were 3 or 4 vendors selling tobacco products, most of them who were having less volume sale, they just gave up. They said, we cannot sell tobacco, and because we are paying annual vend fee, and we are not allowed to sell illicit tobacco, or not allowed to sell open cigarettes, which brings more of the revenue. So they started to not to sell cigarettes. Then yes, the smokeless tobacco, the loose cigarette sale declined accordingly. And yes, when the vendor had himself given it in undertaking that I will not sell it to under 18, and these law restrictions were also displayed on the site, and violators were fined by the district governments. So there were about 71% reduction in under 18 sale recorded in the next 3 years. And the sale point advertisement started disappearing, because we already took an undertaking that we will not advertise tobacco products, although the point of sale ad ban was imposed by the government through an statutory regulatory order in January 2020. But we started restricting these tobacco sellers not to place advertisements of tobacco products on their shops at around 2019. And then one major thing that came up during this licensing process was that most of the times these tobacco vendors would visit the office of the excise department to get a license, apply, and give all these affidavits and everything. But then our field officers started reporting us that most of the tobacco selling points, which were near the educational institutes and few of our high-end pharmacies. There is a trend in our country that most of the pharmacies do have a huge grocery shop or a cosmetic shop within their premises. So they got licenses in the start. But then we changed our policy that the district government, that the excise officers started visiting the location of a tobacco vendor. Whenever they applied for a license, our staff would go to their premises and confirm that it is not within 50 yards of an education institute, or it is not a pharmacy, before issuing a license. So that practice also was checked. Then we talked about, as I said, the revenue collection. You can see the breakdown of our licensing fee and the annual renewal fee. And just with that came along the confiscation and destruction of illicit tobacco. The district administration and the excise department have been very harsh on this illicit tobacco trade. Whenever there was a confiscation, the products have been destroyed, and with imposition of heavy fines. And on the right-hand side, you can see a news cutting also that all the district administration, excise department, and tobacco control officers, hand in hand, for imposing this ban on illicit tobacco trade. So in the bottom lines on the left, you can see the amount of revenue which has been collected over the years through this tobacco ban fee, although it is very minimum, but still it is beyond that federal excise duties and all the taxes which our Federal Bureau of Revenue or whosoever collects from the tobacco industry. So this is helping our subnational level efforts to sustain of our tobacco control. Then talking about the leadership roles on the left-hand side in the picture, I'm sure you can see the international tobacco control leadership combined with our local tobacco control officers and the district governments and the excise departments. And on the right hand, you can see the tobacco control is the priority for our Islamabad excise department, and the vendor licensing is the hallmark of their activities, which is reflected on the title page of their Facebook page. And in the lower end of that picture, you can see all the illicit tobacco, which was confiscated and later destroyed from the market. So the latest development in this vendor licensing is now we have started online tobacco vendors registration for the last about couple of months. And because the vendors have always been complaining that it is very hard for them to take time out and go to the excise office and apply for the license and then get that license and pay fines or maybe some like hassles. So we have started issuing them licenses online for but the first of that, the premises has to be verified, and then they're allowed to process their licensing online, and same applies to their if they are already having a license for over a year and they want to renew it. So that is it. And that online licensing in turn has also made us available database for the dealer information, the tobacco vendors, licensing, density, and everything. The location and all on a click of a mouse. You can get all these data now within on your desktops. This was not happening anywhere in the country before. Coming to the tobacco industry interference, yes, we have seen them, although it has been, we have been very fortunate perhaps that tobacco industry has not interfered too much in at least our this smoke-free cities initiative. But on one stage, yes, the Senate Standing Committee on Health invited us for a presentation that what are our priorities and how we are going to make these cities smoke-free. And to us, that was a golden chance to make this tobacco vendor licensing as a policy matter for the government, for the legislators, that they should, that was the only request which we were going to forward them. But somehow the tobacco industry got a feel of it. And when we were invited to that meeting, we were not allowed to present our case. And next day it was a huge hue and cry in the national press, and all the newspapers carried editorials on that. But that is the maximum which this tobacco industry could do to our initiatives till to date. And we hope that because we have been trying to play within our limits of the laws and nothing beyond that, if the laws restrict us to stay in the urban areas, we are not going for the rural areas. If the law says that, yes, this is the way to do it, that is what we are trying to do. And with that, I'll come to my just presentation endpoint that we have been starting from Islamabad in 2015. And in 2018, we started replicating these models in 12 major cities of Pakistan, and which include about most of the major cities and which house at least our more than 30% of the population of the country. And after Islamabad, the largest province, Punjab, has taken the lead, and the licensing procedure has been adopted, and it will be in a full-fledged law again within a couple of months. So what our try is that if we are able to enforce this tobacco vendor licensing throughout Pakistan, and it will help us in point of sale ad ban implementation also. But we are still facing, although my worthy colleague Ms. Nidhi said that mobile kiosks are getting licensed, but let me admit that for our efforts for Karachi, that is still a licensing dilemma, because these mobile kiosks are around the corners and they vanish at night, and in the morning they again come up. So how to control them? We are working with the district governments, and we are happy that the Commissioner Karachi and all his team are working with us very seriously. I hope in the next meeting of our colleagues and partners, we will be hopeful that we can give you the good news about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Shiraz, for sharing the experience of Pakistan, especially the process of getting the vendor licensing introduced, and how incrementally you are scaling up. And it's an important lesson also, especially where Pakistan is only country actually in the Eastern Mediterranean region which is currently on track to reducing tobacco use by 30% relative reduction by 2025. So all of these measures will be extremely helpful. So thank you, sir, for giving us those feedback. Let me now quickly move on to Mr. Deepak Mishra, who will share his experience from India. Deepak.
Yes, sir. Can I share my screen? Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So, good evening from here, India, and namaste to everyone. I'll tobacco vendor licensing. I'm Deepak Mishra, Executive Director of Socio-Economic and Educational Development Society SEEDS, and I've been working with the different state governments in the country, and working in tobacco control since the last more than a decade now. So I don't have any conflict of interest to report here, and straightway I'll come to the burden of tobacco in India. As you can see here, we are the second largest consumer as well as second largest producer of tobacco. And as far as data is concerned, the figures are concerned, around 27 crore people are using tobacco here in the country, and that comes out around 28.6% of adult population as per Global Adult Tobacco Survey 2 data. And out of this 27 crore, 20 crore people are using smokeless tobacco in our country. These are the type of tobacco being used here as far as smoking is concerned. So cigarette, bidi, hookah, and cigar are the most prominent. Then in the smokeless category, pan masala with zarda tobacco, we call earlier it was called gutka. Then khaini is very prominent, and other kind of zarda and kimam and pan and with zarda. These are all commonly used here as smokeless in a smokeless form. So why vendor licensing? I'll straightway come down to vendor licensing. So why it is required? Because in our country there is law called COTPA, Cigarette and Other Tobacco Product Act. It was passed by the Indian Parliament in 2003, and as per the provision of COTPA, all the educational institutions are supposed to be the tobacco free, and no tobacco shops should be there within the 100 yards of any of the educational institutions. So the sale of tobacco is banned within 100 yards. But oftenly one can see it is being done here because lack of enforcement by the law enforcers. Then it will give a good opportunity to in fact tobacco-free institutions, to make institutions as tobacco-free. Then other tobacco control laws compliance will be there because of this vendor licensing. We can map the tobacco selling shops, ban on specific, ban on sale of tobacco from grocery shop, like so the number of shop, and of course the other part will be it will enhance the revenue of the government. So this is why the tobacco vendor licensing is very much required. How it all started in India. In September 2017, Government of India Ministry of Health has issued an advisory to all the state governments for mandatory vendor licensing in their respective area through municipal authorities. And we grabbed the opportunity and straightway in the state of Bihar, Patna, the state capital. So Patna Municipal Corporation had issued this first vendor license order in the country in November 2017 itself, because the Bihar Municipal Act has had the provision for vendor licensing, and there was a provision under section for this issue of license for the tobacco traders as well. So, but that legislation, that order was not implemented because of tobacco industry interference. There was a huge protest against those orders, and even the government was not able to draft the rules and regulations for that tobacco vendor license in Bihar. So it was held back. But apart from that, other states like Himachal Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal, Karnataka, Rajasthan, Uttarakhand, and Jharkhand, these states have issued state-specific order for vendor licensing. Out of this, Himachal had passed a legislation in its assembly for ban on sale of loose cigarette and other type of tobacco restrictions, and also there was the rule was passed for vendor licensing, but still that is not being implemented because of certain reasons. But the state like Jharkhand, I'll explain you about the development in Jharkhand. And Jharkhand has done phenomenally well and in the country, and thanks to union, they have supported seats for taking this opportunity up and work with the local municipal corporation. So as per Jharkhand Municipal Act, under section 455, this provision was already there under schedule 187, the tobacco including snuff, cigar, cigarette, and bidi for their storing, packaging, processing. So the license was mandatory. So we took up this, we explored this provision, and contacted local authority, local municipal authority, and we also sensitized them. The municipal commissioner and the mayor, city mayor was there, and all the corporators were there in RMC meeting, and we sensitized them, and they agreed to start to initiate the tobacco vendor licensing in Ranchi Municipal Authority. So it was started with the institutional structure. Municipal commissioner has created an institutional structure. They have appointed deputy municipal commissioner as the nodal officer for tobacco control program in Ranchi Municipal Authority. Then a city enforcement squad at Ranchi RMC was notified for the enforcement and implementation, and the RMC commissioner has issued implementation order for separately for section 4, section 5, and section 6A of COTPA Act, and more primarily for to prevent minors from the tobacco use. So this was very helpful while working on this issue in the city area. And as I mentioned, Ranchi was the first municipal authority in the country who has implemented tobacco vendor licensing. So the RMC commissioner issued the order first in April 2018, and they took the lead. They framed the rules and all, and started working on that. They have given this thing in. They have issued public notice through various local newspapers for tobacco vendors to get the license from the municipal authority, and media has supported like anything. And it is a great support from media and for the awareness to the local vendors and traders as well. And a training program was organized in Ranchi Municipal Corporation. You can see here Mr. Ashish ji is there, and we all given the training to the municipal authority officials, and some vendors were also included in this training workshop so that the message could percolate to the grassroots and they could get the license and they could understand the issue. Also, the traders association were involved in this whole exercise in this training workshop. And finally, the license was issued to the traders in Ranchi Municipal Corporation, and the terms and conditions were laid down in the license. Here you can see the copy of license in the right side of the screen, and the license condition was that there will not be any sale of tobacco within 100 yards of educational institution, no sale by and to and by the minors, and also display the mandatory signage under basic provisions of Code PA. There won't be any direct or indirect advertisement or promotion of tobacco product at that point of sale. Then printing of, the compliance of section 7, which says that the 85% mandatory pictorial warning is there. So there won't be any product sold at that point of sale without any pictorial warning. And also compliance of various other provisions, other supporting laws of JJ Act, which is very stringent here, and which says that if you will sell tobacco to any of the minors, you will be liable for 7 years of imprisonment or 1 lakh of rupees fine, or both. So it is very stringent. So these are orders. Then no littering of cigarette butts and other tobacco products under this smart city mission, and they have to keep the garbage bins to keep those cigarette butts. Then last is maintained, although it is not being maintained, but it is there. The timing to open the shop. Those shops will be closed on some public national public holidays, like on Republic Day, Independence Day, and 2nd October. And exclusives, those licensee shops will only sell tobacco product, exclusively for tobacco product. There won't be any sale of any chips or chocolates or biscuits, candies or cool drinks. They won't be sold there at the licensed shop. So these are the provisions and being implemented in the local city the mayor and the municipal commissioner and other officials in front of all the corporators and trade association people, and few vendors were also invited again here. And this was done with support from the union, and Dr. Nidhi was kind enough to come down to Ranchi for this event and for this release purpose. Then so far, and one good thing there in the Jharkhand, I can share with you that it is this whole, not only vendor licensing, tobacco control as a whole program is being reviewed by the Chief Secretary of the state at least once in a year, and he chairs the meeting, and their tobacco vendor licensing has been discussed and it was highly appreciated. And the chairman of State Tobacco Control Coordination Committee, the Chief Secretary of the state, has issued orders to replicate Ranchi model in whole state in all the ULB, urban local bodies in the state. And so far 27 urban local bodies in the state have issued orders, and few of the ULBs have already started implementing this tobacco vendor licensing issue process. There are certain challenges also we have been facing, and the most important is interference of tobacco industry in the policy implementation. Recently, we have received a threat letter from a front group of tobacco industry, the local tobacco vendors association, and to do the agitation and all from in front of our house and the office. So we had to take the support of the local police also in this process. Then there is a social and cultural acceptability of tobacco in few of the states here in India, and rampant. You must have you would have seen that out of 27 crore tobacco user, 20 crore people are using smokeless tobacco, and there's a rampant use of smokeless tobacco. The tobacco cultivation is also in several states in our country, and as we see that we are the second largest producer of tobacco also, and the aggressive marketing by tobacco industry through all medium, right? Be it the print media, be it the electronic media, news channels, social media. So everywhere you can see the big hoardings in the name of other product, but of the same brand. So it is there. Then tobacco control is still not a priority for the government as it would have been so far, and overburdened officials and I mean, with their competitive priorities, it is a big challenge for us, because we get trained. I mean, the officials who are responsible for the implementation of the program, and very frequently they have been transferred, and ultimately the lack of training and capacity building of law enforcers because of this frequent transfer. So these are certain challenges we have been facing here in our country, in India. And the way forward, basically, we need to basically expand this to pan India now, and the rest of the states has to follow, and they have been following. Few of the states have initiated tobacco vendor licensing here in the country. So this is all about by the status of tobacco vendor licensing in India. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mishra, for sharing your insights in the TVL in India, especially linking it to the implementation of the tobacco control law, the COTPA, and also identifying the challenges. So in the middle of all that, if the chief secretary is able to review this and you are getting industry threats, then obviously this is seeming to work. So feel rest assured it's working. Then you will continue to get threats from the industry. So that will be part of the work, but we should discuss this maybe in the panel discussion. So thank you all the speakers till now. We've run out of time, so we will not have the QA session now, and we will head to the break. So I'm over to Kathy and Caroline to tell us how many minutes we have for the break.
Thank you. We'll break for 5 minutes, and I recommend that you do not log off from Zoom meeting. I will display a countdown slide for your convenience, so you know when to come back. But we should come back at the 3:27 p.m. Paris time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back to participants. The course will now resume.
Wonderful. Welcome back, and thank you all for keeping to the short break time. We're now into our session with panelists and an opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to introduce very briefly, and due to our lack of time and break with protocol a little bit, I'll do a very brief introduction of our expert panelists. Please put your questions in the chat. We have, and our speakers from the previous session can also jump in and answer some questions. So let me go ahead. Our panelists for our discussion are Dr. Amit Yadav. He's a senior technical advisor with the Union's Southeast Asia office and also a postdoctoral scholar with the Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education at the University of California, San Francisco in the United States. And Dr. Yadav has been working in tobacco control for 13 years. Our next panelist is Mr. Ashish Pandey. He's Deputy Director of Tobacco Control of the Tobacco Control Department of the Union in the headquarters office in New York City. Mr. Pandey works closely with country teams in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan to further reduce tobacco use. We've got Dr. Vanek Prasad, who is the unit head and leads the WHO No Tobacco, Tobacco-Free Initiative team, and is responsible for the overall coordination of global tobacco control program at WHO, including liaising with the WHO regions and with the convention secretariat of the WHO FCTC. And we have Dr. Stella Bialis. She's a professor at the University of California in San Francisco, and her research focuses on the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, tobacco industry monitoring, and building nurses' capacity for tobacco control nationally and internationally. And you'll see the more extended bios in the chat. So welcome to the panelists. Thanks so much. And I'm going to be monitoring the chat for questions, but let me just start with one question. And that is, in your experience, what are some of the most effective arguments in favor of tobacco vendor licensing that have been used to convince policymakers to move forward with this approach? And maybe just whoever wants to jump in, any of our panelists, then we can go to the speakers if they have anything to add.
Hi, everybody. I can start, Joanna, if that's okay. I think that our experience here in California, where we actually have a state license and then cities have their separate license, so it's two levels. But at the local level, I think the best arguments was the equity argument, because there was more retail in areas that were more disparities on tobacco use and tobacco related. So trying to promote equity in access to health and demonstrating the link between poverty, disease, inequity, and the number of retailers. The second is the youth argument, the access to youth. So that helps with some of the zoning in terms of being away from schools or far away from schools and internally. And I think the third thing that really helped was having data from the retailers themselves on what was the proportion of funding or revenues that they got from tobacco products, because that allowed to work with retailers to have strategies so they wouldn't have extreme loss of revenues. And it turns out that none did.
Thank you, Stella. Does anyone else want to address that question? It's really helpful.
Yeah, I can add. Of course, the protection of youth has been our prime argument for making vendor licensing as a reality. But at the same time, there are some other aspects, including enforcement of other tobacco control laws related to smoke-free, related to tax ban, which is mandatory. This has been a nightmare for law enforcers. And when we see the tobacco control in its totality and comprehensively, we see the importance of a vendor licensing to regulate the number of point of sale where this law requires to be implemented. Another aspect is stopping the tax evasions and controlling illicit trade. That's another aspect where government and law enforcers are interested to take up vendor licensing as an important steps for controlling illicit trade. So yeah, thanks.
Terrific, thank you. Is there anything anyone else would like to add? Okay, let's move on to another question. This is sort of focusing on implementation and enforcement. And are any of our panelists interested in speaking to the roles that community or the public or CSOs, NGOs can play in effectively implementing a tobacco vendor licensing policy?
Adriana, maybe I can start, Joanna. I think just go back to a broader discussion for a minute, that Article 13 of the Framework Convention, which was considered to be an easy win, had a very strict implementation timeline. You know, every party comes into force for your entry into force, you within a defined period, you should get it fixed, right? And then when we look at Empower policy progress and the E of Empower, which is all of these advertising, it's one of the worst implemented. It's almost competing with tax, which is outside of our health sector. So we really need to understand, where is the incentive? Why is it not an incentive? So there could be two aspects to it. One, that we have not been able to show the evidence of the impact of this work on Article 13 implementation. As a community, we seem to have not worked very hard on that one. TVL is just one part of it, but it's an important element. And I think when I say the second part would be, where is the incentive? Who creates the incentive? The local authorities, if they're interested, the community needs to be sensitized. Where is the money? Do I go to the national government? So there you create an incentive, either through the law to pick the fines and put in the local authority, or the licensing. So it could be an opportunity that the tobacco vendor license becomes a revenue model. Forget public health for now. Revenue model, get some money, bring that engagement, get the participation of the community. You get your wins, banning sale to minors, getting implementation of victorial warning, everything else which everybody has talked about. So I see that as a kind of a way forward to helping accelerate Article 13. There are many other suggestions which the parties are all considering in terms of accelerating Article 13, but this could also be one of the way forward to it. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Vanek. So I think no, you have made a very important point, and I think, and that's what we are also thinking and looking at. If we are doing tobacco vendor licensing, we are actually helping implement other provisions as well, and no, not only Article 13, but let's say Article 5.3 tobacco industry interference, or even for smoke-free public places, or even awareness generation. And as one of the question Dr. Julius has asked, that how do you bring producer, seller, customer, and government at the same page? So I think that is where if you are doing tobacco vendor licensing, you are putting everyone on the same place. No, even the customer would say, okay, I get the tobacco product at a vendor, specified vendor. No, even the government knows that, okay, these are the people who sell tobacco, and you are also looking at the people who are who has to comply. So they know that my license conditions are these, and I need to comply with these provisions. So I think that's a very important point that you are making, and I think we need to talk more about it as a important tobacco control strategy. If this can be done, we are good for enforcement. The E of empower. I think this is a very critical area for achieving the E of empower. And if we do the tobacco vendor licensing. Yeah.
Super, and thank you for addressing the question in the chat, Dr. Amit. Again, thinking about implementation and enforcement, maybe from our panelists, also our country speakers, from your experience, which are the authorities that are best suited to administer, implement, and enforce tobacco vendor license restrictions?
In our experience, we saw that it's much easier for municipal authorities or a city administration to do that, because they give the licensing for the shop and establishment in those areas, and they do those regular inspections and make it compliant. So in our view, they are the best place to enforce tobacco vendor licensing. Yeah.
Thank you, Ashish. Would anyone like to add to that?
I would like to just add that I think again specifically if you have a designated agency that is working for enforcing, administering and looking at that, but I think we need to also look at decentralized kind of administration, because if it is through a municipal corporation, I think the authorities within the municipal corporation are much effective in doing that within that limit. But let's say if it is in a district, where you have even panchayati raj or local self-governance people, or if you have other agencies who are working also. So I think that should be also in terms of they should be engaged. To me, I think every tobacco control instrument, every tobacco control strategy needs a multi-department and multi-agency approach to make it more effective. So I think that would be good, to enforce it. And I think as Dr. Bialaus has suggested in a chat about CSO's role, that is also very important. Tobacco control, I think many of even the existing provisions at some of the places we are not intending them to be penalizing provisions, rather not making it a social change. So people do not smoke in public, or people comply with other regulations, put pictorial warning, do not advertise. So if you look at if you go and look at how many of them are penalized, the numbers are very less. But the fact that one or two enforcement happens and people are sensitized towards that, you have better compliances. So I think having CSO engaged in the whole enforcement mechanism also is an important aspect. So because they are part of it, and they further encourage other people to to implement and within the community. One of the examples I want to give from our Section 6 compliance, which is not selling tobacco within 100 yards of educational institution. Now, if you have vendor licensing, that makes it easier because you will not give license to people within 100 yards. Secondly, in one of our state, Karnataka, what the students have done, so they, as part of their students' activity, what they have done a rose campaign, and they took roses and they went around the 100 yards of their educational institution or the surrounding and told these tobacco sellers that please don't sell tobacco, and they gave them roses that please do not sell tobacco, and it is both violation of law and also not good for us to be exposed to tobacco around our schools. So I think that also works. So I think we need to do both. I think carrot and stick approach, when we are talking about enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to turn to the tobacco industry because they're always looming large. And I'd like to ask the panelists, and if the speakers want to comment as well, what, in your experience, are some of the common tobacco industry tactics that have been used to circumvent as well as discourage implementing tobacco vendor licensing laws? And the second part of that, are there good examples of how we can counter those tactics? So who would like to go first?
So may I? Hi, this is Mahbub Alam Tahir from Bangladesh. So in Bangladesh, we are facing the first time they raise the voice. This is not possible to implement. It's very difficult to implement this kinds of decision. And second argument, that one, it is hamper the poor people. Where there is a lot of poor people who are running business, and that kinds of business, that kinds of licensing will hamper their livelihood. So this is the two arguments they spread among the policymakers. And as I share my presentation, there is another thought of some people mind that if vendor licensing is started, it may be legalized their business. And somehow I think that they are also suffering this kinds of sense that in Bangladesh they can get a paper. The main target is that they stop the licensing process. But as I shared that one in Bangladesh, when the licensing is started, initially it will be issue licensing for a lot of people, but gradually next few years we can able to regulate the licensing. When we extended the jurisdiction, now we mentioned that within the 100 meters of the school and health center, that is no license will be issued for tobacco selling. Then we can extend this jurisdiction. So I think that industry separate that. So there's another argument that yeah, this is maybe legalize their business. So three arguments they're putting in form of the policymakers and the general people. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can just add, I mean, what the industry will do is the usual, right? Spread misinformation, use the front group, make sure there's going to be an economic disaster, it's going to affect the small business. I think there's some of the things to counter that, if I can focus more a little bit on that, just for variety. I think a couple of things. One is make sure you have vendors on your coalition that is supporting that. Try to do some community work, and that may take time. And I think that's one of the things. Some of these are not going to be implemented very fast. So you can have some counter arguments to like, all vendors going to hate this, because if you have some vendors that actually like this, and I think some of the presentation shows that not all vendors are opposed to it, to have a more level playing field. I think one of the tricky things, and we saw that with other policies, is make sure that in your enforcement, if you have fines, there is a growing fine up to closing of the shop, because the industry might pay fines for some shops to make sure shops don't get discouraged. And so they might like, oh, you got a fine, don't worry about it, I'll pay for your fine. But if the fine is progressive and could lead to the person losing their business eventually after a certain number of infractions, that might give it pause. One thing is that, the industry paying a small fee or a fine, but the industry just to keep it open and to keep defiance of the law. So I think it's important that in your enforcement mechanism, there is serious consequences for repeat offenses. That is not just keep paying fees and fees and fees and continue to circumvent the law, for years to come. So I think it's very important to have that and to have some local data, because the industry will come up with data. And so getting some pre and post data, if you can, so you can have some arguments against the misinformation.
If I may add, yeah, I totally second Dr. Balu's thought on this about keeping the the tobacco retailers or a tobacco retailer association on our side, it's better to reach out to them beforehand and sensitize them. There are studies which shows that there is a mixed opinion about this existing policy, and vendors welcome the licensing system rather than being penalized at the later stage or harassed by the law enforcers. So a sensitization and a synergetic approach, a collaborative approach with them reaching to this policy is a definitely a good option, I would say that.
Excellent. So thank you. Thanks for all your insights. So just to wrap up in the few minutes that we have, I just want to ask one more question of the panelists and speakers, and that is, in no more than one sentence, please, if you have any advice to this group, either about passing tobacco vendor licensing, implementing, enforcing, fighting the tobacco industry, if you have one sentence to leave the group with, please go ahead, and please keep it to one sentence because we do want to wrap up. Thank you. Anyone would like to offer anything?
Sure, I'll start as always. One sentence: do it, but prepare before you start, and use colleagues and other experience. So learn from others. So don't repeat mistakes. That was 2 sentences.
Excellent. Anyone else?
Just to add on that, it's the sensitize, find your collaborators, your strong supporter for that, and be prepared with the step-by-step guidelines how to enforce it. It's not just passing the policies, it's the most critical part is enforcing the policy.
Yeah, and I think use the existing mechanism. I think legislating a new provision or getting into new laws on new things might be a difficult one. So even if you are able to do within the existing norms and existing provisions, so get in through there, and then maybe at a later stage have a full-blown tobacco vendor licensing law. But for the time being, I think it is easier. Like examples were shown about the Municipal Corporation Acts. They already have provisions for vendor licensing on tobacco or other product. Just add tobacco there and do it.
Just to add to what Amit said, keep the bigger picture always on the centerpiece. Tobacco control, accelerating implementation of the FCTC. That is important. How TVL helps achieve whichever part of the provision, we can keep making that list, but we can, whichever the country would want to see progress happen, work on that in that narrative rather than showing TVL as a standalone, something very interesting, new initiative. Part of tobacco control, stay within that.
Good point, sir.
All excellent points. Any last words of advice before we do our wrap up?
May I say something?
Please.
In this fight with tobacco, we only have to be treading with utmost care. Nothing irrational, or like my senior Mr. Prasad said, if we are getting too much involved in one point, then we are losing the sight of the whole panorama. So we have to focus on our basic goal and take steps accordingly. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, if anyone else has any words of advice, please put it in the chat, and it's all participants can participate in that. So what I'm going to do is introduce Mr. Karam Hashmi, who's going to sum up the panel discussion, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Vinayak for his closing remarks. So Karam Hashmi is the technical advisor for the Union's Global Implementation Program in Pakistan. He works closely with national and provincial governments and NGOs for policy development, implementation, and capacity building of stakeholders in Pakistan. He is also the Pakistan focal point for the STOP initiative, or Stopping Tobacco Organizations and Products, to implement activities and expand our work to reduce tobacco industry influence. So Khurram Hashmi, over to you for some final remarks.
Thank you, Joanna. It has been a very informative session, and yes, we do realize that tobacco use is the killer of billions, no doubt about that. And we are thankful for all the presenters and experts who have contributed with such a rich information and knowledge on the subject. Significance of tobacco vendor licensing is fly-side measure for advancing tobacco control, vendor licensing overview of all these. The panel and the discussion overall has been very clear. Protection of the youth is a priority also for the enforcement of the tobacco control laws, which is a mandatory. And this is also a nightmare for the enforcers. We have seen the discussions revolving about, and no doubt, the importance of vendor licensing for stopping tax evasions and controlling of illicit trade. This is an area we have realized that the government is most interested in, especially in LMICs from the revenue generation point of view. And for implementation and enforcement of this policy process, this is where the community, the public, and the CSOs can play an important role. And it has been highlighted out. FCTC and especially Article 13 is an easy win. And the progress of the Empower, where E seems to be the most challenged, since there is no incentive, there are need have been identified for the evidences to implement the Article 5.3. Tobacco vendor licensing has been identified as one part, which is important, but the second part, where the incentive lies actually and the opportunities are there, are the revenue model to get the money for the government, which would be supporting the implementation of the tobacco control laws. This can be one of the way forwards. And the discussion also looked towards vendor licensing to help other provisions, and not just limited to the Article 13, but also the implementation of Article 5.3. Which can also go along with the awareness, not just for the government, but the public at the same time, defining their roles of the involved, that how, with a clear understanding, whether vendors, consumers directly or indirectly affected, this is a critical area to achieve the E of the Empower through raising the awareness. And the best authorities remains to enforce the vendor licensing are the administration or the municipals, that actually gives the licensing to the vendors and hold regular inspection for the compliances of the laws. They can play the critical and the most important role. And significantly, since this was also discussed, that bringing on board the district administration can decentralize the process, which can be effective for the already overburdened authorities that have been engaged in other areas of the world. So the district administration can also play their role as a vital for the tobacco controls multi-sectoral approach or multi-departmental, interdepartmental point of view. And this is an area where CSOs can also support the process for bringing the social change. The point of view is that, and highlighting the results of the compliance will improve the enforcement aspect of this side. And this is the area where certain suggestions came out from the discussions that students can also play the important role, since we can see the vendors' presence on very short distances, nearing most the evidence and the mapping suggests that these are the areas which have been covered by the vendors are the education institutions, and there is a strong need to raise awareness, and students can play that role by reaching out to the vendors that are mostly situated near the educational areas. And when it comes to the challenges, yes, tobacco industry has always been looming large. Their common tactic is to discourage the vendor licensing. And since one of their strongest claim was that it is impossible to implement this kind of a process, which at least 5 of our presentation have rejected, that it will not affect poor people's business and livelihood, but it will rather legalize the whole process. And the main target remains to stop the process itself by the industry. That can be done by having the gradual regulation of the process. This will challenge the tobacco industry, where information and support from partners for the sustainability of the work can come forward to. And for achieving that, the suggestions by the discussions, it has been the number one to get the vendors on your side so they can support you. And it is better to reach out to them since the studies have showed that they rather avoid any kind of penalties and any kind of harassment from the government side. But they do need time to get on board with satisfaction, especially when they know that that not all of them are actually opposing or supporting the industry's arguments. If the industry wants to pay fine, let them pay fine. The fine should be progressive. So ultimately, the industry would be discouraged. And this tactic can be taken care of. The penalties should be high to discourage any circumventions by the tobacco industry or the vendors. So if we can do it, we should do it with preparation in advance, utilizing others' experience to avoid the mistake, sensitizing and finding your strong support with step-by-step guidelines with an intention to enforce the policy and not for the just sake of passing these policies and let these be. We need to do with these within the existing norms and the existing legislations rather than going for a new act. And we should keep the bigger picture in the centerpiece that tobacco control and acceleration of the FCTC are critical for getting the progress happening on ground. We only have to be treating the subject with utmost care and should not lose our sight on all the panorama with the focus on the goal and taking the steps accordingly. This has been a unanimous suggestions and advice and kind of a way forward suggested by the group. I hope I have covered everything. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Hashmi. You have captured it very well, actually, very well. You've covered all the points from different sessions and also summarized it very well in terms of how, if any country wants to move forward, how the stakeholders should be pushing the country. So there's actually very little to add to what your summary is in terms of what more. I think it's important to document this. It's important to show that it is possible to be a part of a good enforcement tool for tobacco control. If the evidence is there and it's practically possible, then it should be added to our enforcement guides, enforcement tools as an easy to move forward approach. So I really want to thank all of the participants, speakers, panelists who brought out some of this, after so many years in tobacco control, I actually didn't know much about tobacco vendor license. We keep hearing about Ranchi and everything, but we haven't gone into the details of how it's happening, what are the evidence. So excellent work. Thank you very much. And I must thank Joanna and the organizers, Caroline and Kathy and Nidhi and Dr. Rana for making this happen. So back to you, Joanna, for any 30-second comments.
No, everyone has said it so well. I know we're at time. So thank you so much to the union for organizing such an important workshop. And again, I'll echo Vinayak's thanks to our excellent speakers and panelists who have just provided such terrific, very practical knowledge for moving things forward and learning from experiences. So thanks so much. And I think, do we have any final wrap up from the union?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for attending today's workshop. And once this Zoom meeting closes, you will see a survey appear in your browser. So we would really appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. It's important you complete the survey right after the workshop, as the link will only be available for a short period of time. And you will receive a follow-up email in the next couple days with a link to view a recording of today's event. And on behalf of the union and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.